A young innocent cleaning lady discovered a $10 million mistake. No one else noticed. The powerful billionaire never even looked at her before. Now he's on his knees begging for her forbidden love. If this story caught your eye, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Sarah arrived before sunrise, when the mirrored glass of the 40-story building reflected only the suffocating darkness of New York City, and the corporate corridors held a silence as heavy as her routine. Her light blue uniform, with the Morgan Holdings logo embroidered on the left chest, seemed to absorb all her 20-year-old youth, leaving exposed only the invisible woman in the eyes of executives who passed by her as if she were part of the furniture. At 20, she had never been kissed, never felt a man's touch on her skin, believed that love was a luxury too distant for someone who woke up at 4 in the morning to catch 3 buses to downtown, for someone who saved every penny to buy her mother's prescription medications, who lived immersed in a depression that seemed to swallow their entire home in Brighton Beach. Her father, Anthony, who died in a bus accident on the Jersey Turnpike, when she was 15, always repeated with the tired voice of a bricklayer who worked Sundays and holidays that there are souls born to serve, and there's no shame in that, girl, as long as you serve with dignity. But inside Sarah, between the ribs that ached from carrying heavy buckets and the heart that raced every time she needed to enter the higher floors of the building, a small cry of dignity insisted on living, like a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished by the cold wind of reality. That Tuesday dawn, while cleaning with mechanical movements the executive kitchen on the 40th floor, Sarah saw a silver laptop open to a spreadsheet, displaying figures so absurd that it made her stomach turn. She didn't know English well, never had money for language courses, but she recognized numbers as if they were her mother tongue. She had learned mental calculation selling homemade cupcakes at the traffic light on Eastern Parkway with her mother. On weekends when they managed to get out of bed and pretend they had the strength to face the world. The fiscal code, glowing on the screen, showed a diversion that she quickly calculated to be more than $10 million, a sum larger than the monthly revenue of the entire Latin American branch of the company. Trembling as if she had a fever, Sarah looked around, made sure she was alone, and with fingers that could barely hold the paper, printed the screen on the nearby printer. The noise of the machine working seemed to echo throughout the floor like thunder. She folded the sheet into 4 parts and tucked it inside her apron pocket, feeling an ancestral primitive fear that told her to forget everything, go home, pretend she never saw anything. But her conscience, shaped by her dead father's rigid honesty, wouldn't allow her to simply ignore something so serious. The next day, while cleaning the presidential office an hour before the workday began, Sarah saw the company owner in person for the first time. Lawrence Morgan was 35, a naturalized American citizen originally from Italy, and his presence dominated the environment as if the air became denser around him. Eyes grey like winter rain, beard trimmed with military precision, broad shoulders that filled a navy blue suit that seemed to have been sewn directly onto his body. Widowed for 6 years, he had never again been involved with any woman, and all employees whispered through the corridors that he kept dark secrets about the death of his pregnant wife, who had fallen from their penthouse apartment balcony in circumstances that were never fully clarified. When Sarah entered the room carrying the disinfectant bucket, the smell of cleaning products mixed with her cheap sweet grass perfume, Lawrence raised his eyes from the document he was signing and frowned with irritation. His voice came out cutting like broken glass when he ordered her to leave immediately, to return after business hours. But Sarah, with her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it, approached the solid mahogany desk and, trembling like a leaf in the wind, placed the printed paper on the scattered documents. Lawrence picked up the paper with abrupt movements, irritated by the interruption, but when his eyes scanned the printed lines, his hand began to tremble almost imperceptibly. He had spent the entire night awake, reviewing contracts and spreadsheets, desperately searching for this error that he knew existed somewhere in the thousands of documents that crossed his desk daily. An error that, if not corrected in time, would destroy international contracts that had taken years to negotiate and would make the holding company's market value plummet like a stone thrown from the top floor of the building. It was a simple extra zero inserted in a graphene import line, a material the company used to develop cutting-edge technologies. But this seemingly insignificant zero would open space for investigations that would reveal the largest money laundering scheme in Morgan Holdings history, a scheme that Lawrence didn't even know existed, orchestrated by people he blindly trusted. Without raising his eyes to Sarah, who remained standing beside the desk like an ice statue, Lawrence muttered in a hoarse voice that she should leave, forget what she had seen, never mention it to anyone. But his words came out without conviction because, for the first time in 6 years since he had buried his wife and the child who was never born, he felt vulnerable in front of another person. That afternoon, after spending hours on the phone with lawyers and auditors, Lawrence ordered the Human Resources Department to locate Sarah Silver Johnson. He wanted to know everything about her, where she came from, how she had managed to identify an error that accountants trained at expensive universities failed to detect. When Sarah entered his office again, summoned by a phone call that made her think she would be fired, her hands were so wet with sweat that they left damp marks on the cheap fabric of her uniform. Lawrence observed her with the attention of a predator studying its prey, noticing every detail that had gone unnoticed the first time. The chestnut hair, the color of coffee with milk, tied in a loose bun that let some rebellious strands escape around her face. The smell of cheap glycerin soap, the kind sold in neighborhood pharmacies, mixed with the persistent aroma of floral disinfectant that seemed to have impregnated her skin. The large eyes, brown like dark honey that hid a fierce dignity beneath layers of fear and shyness. Through the discreet investigation he ordered, Lawrence discovered that Sarah hadn't attended college due to extreme poverty, that she supported a mother with serious mental problems, that she had lost her father in an accident that left the family in a desperate financial situation. But he also discovered that she did complex mathematical calculations with impressive precision, that she had a photographic memory for numbers and a natural intuition for detecting inconsistencies in documents. His heart, hardened by years of mourning and the calculated coldness of corporate business, felt a small crack, like when ice begins to melt under the morning sun. But along with the unexpected enchantment he felt while observing Sarah, a desire was also born that deeply embarrassed him. She was so clearly untouched, so pure in her innocence, that her very presence seemed sacred. To desire her was to profane something he never deserved to touch, to stain with his hands, dirty with blood and money, something that shone like clean light. He hired her as a temporary assistant, with a salary 3 times higher than what she earned as a cleaner, to help him in the internal audit that would be necessary to correct the error and its consequences. Sarah accepted with tears in her eyes, unable to believe that her life could change so drastically from one day to the next. Over the following weeks, working side by side in the office she used to just clean, Sarah revealed herself to be much more than a human calculator. She organized files that nobody bothered to read, discovering strange patterns in transactions, identifying secret deposits to foundations that existed only on paper. Her mind, shaped by the need for survival, saw connections that escaped the eyes of experienced professionals. It was during one of these investigations that Sarah found a document that made her cry alone in the break room where she used to drink her black bitter coffee. It was a bank transfer receipt dated 4 years ago, when her mother had attempted suicide and the public hospital rejected her due to lack of beds in the psychiatric ward. The bill for the private treatment that saved her mother's life had been paid by an anonymous donor. The name on the transfer was Lawrence Morgan. Their destiny had already been crossed long before they met, woven by invisible threads that Sarah was only now beginning to see. She remembered that terrible day when she found her mother on the bathroom floor, wrists cut, blood-forming red puddles on the cold floor. The desperate run to the hospital, doctors saying there were no vacancies, that she should look elsewhere, as if the life of a poor person was worth less than an empty bed. Then, like a miracle, a man in a dark suit appeared, spoke with the doctors, signed papers, and suddenly her mother was being admitted to the best room in the psychiatric ward. Sarah never knew who that man was, never managed to see him clearly through the tears that blurred her vision. But now, holding that trembling document between her fingers, She understood that Lawrence had been there, that he had saved her family when she needed it most. Questions multiplied in her mind like weeds. Why had he done that? How did he know about her situation? Why would a rich man, owner of a multinational company, care about the fate of an unknown woman from the outskirts? She wanted to confront him, but every time she tried to gather courage, her words died in her throat when she faced those grey eyes that seemed to carry entire storms. Meanwhile, the investigation revealed increasingly deeper layers of corruption. Sarah discovered that the company's CFO, an elegant 50-year-old man named Richard Monroe, not only diverted funds through falsified spreadsheets, but used the money to finance an international human trafficking network. The documents she meticulously organized showed transfers to ghost accounts in tax havens, payments to shell companies that transported special merchandise across borders. The most disturbing part was discovering that some of this merchandise was people, mainly young people from poor families who disappeared without a trace. Sarah felt her stomach turn every time she found new evidence, imagining how many families were suffering like hers had suffered, how many brothers and children were lost somewhere in the world, sold as objects. That's when the anonymous letters began to arrive. The first was left in her locker in the changing room, written with letters cut out from magazines like in suspense movies. "Quit this job or your mother will be next." Sarah read those words with trembling hands, the paper seeming to burn between her fingers. The second letter arrived a week later, more specific and terrifying. "We know where you live. We know your mother stays alone during the day. Stop meddling where you shouldn't." She didn't tell Lawrence anything, afraid he would fire her to protect her, afraid of losing the job that had changed her life. But the constant terror began to affect her sleep, her concentration. She installed extra locks on her home door, asked the neighbor to keep an eye on her mother during the day, started looking over her shoulder every time she walked through the neighborhood streets. Lawrence realized something was wrong. Sarah, who had always been shy but determined, now seemed constantly frightened, jumped when he spoke to her, compulsively checked her phone as if expecting bad news. Her eyes, once bright with intellectual curiosity, now carried deep shadows. One night, working late to finish analyzing a particularly complex batch of documents, Sarah finally decided to leave when the clock struck midnight. The building was completely empty, the corridors illuminated only by emergency lights that created ghostly shadows on the walls. She entered the elevator, pressed the ground floor button, and began the descent from the 40 floors. That's when everything went wrong. The elevator began to descend very quickly, then stopped abruptly between the 20th and 19th floors with a horrible metallic noise. The lights flickered once, twice, and went out completely. Sarah found herself plunged into absolute darkness, her heart beating so hard it seemed to want to burst from her chest. She pressed all the buttons on the panel, screamed for help until her voice was hoarse, beat on the metal doors with her fists until they were sore and bloody. The silence of the empty building swallowed her screams like a hungry monster. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes that seemed eternal. Sarah huddled in the corner of the elevator, hugging her knees, crying from fear and cold. Outside, a storm began to punish New York, thunder echoing like gunshots in the dark sky. That's when she heard Lawrence's voice shouting her name through the corridors. He had returned to the office to retrieve some documents and seen the elevator light flashing on the building's control panel. Using only the strength of his arms and an iron bar he found in the supply closet, he managed to force the elevator doors. When Lawrence managed to open the elevator doors, he found Sarah huddled on the floor like a wounded animal, her face wet with tears, eyes wide with terror. He was soaked from the storm that had descended upon the city, his tailored suit clinging to his body, dark hair dripping water onto his forehead. Without hesitation, he bent down and pulled her out of that metal prison, embracing her with a force that seemed to want to absorb all her fear into his own chest. His wet suit stuck to the rigid muscles of his arms and chest, and Sarah could feel the heat of his masculine body through the cold fabric, could hear the accelerated beats of his heart mixed with hers. Lawrence's warm breath mingled with the salty tears running down her face, creating a faint vapor between them. He murmured words in Italian that she didn't understand, but that sounded like promises of protection, like sacred oaths. In that desperate embrace, surrounded by the noise of rain beating against the windows of the empty building, Sarah felt something she had never experienced in her 20 years of life: desire. Not the passive desire to be possessed like an object, as she had always imagined love would be, but the active desire to touch, to know, to completely surrender to someone. It was as if a flame had been lit inside her, burning all her certainties about herself. And Lawrence, holding that small, trembling body in his arms, understood with frightening clarity that Sarah was not just the untouchable purity he had imagined. She was fire, a fire that could burn him alive, that could destroy all the walls he had built around his heart in the last 6 years. Her scent, a mixture of fear and sweetness, invaded his senses like a powerful drug. When they finally separated, they remained looking at each other in silence, his eyes searching in hers for a permission she didn't know how to give, her eyes searching in his for a promise he didn't know if he could make. The storm outside seemed to echo the storm growing between them, electric and dangerous. But the magic of the moment was interrupted when Lawrence brutally remembered the reality that surrounded them. He had an arranged marriage agreement with Isabella Ross, daughter of his former father-in-law, who controlled 30% of Morgan Holdings shares. After the death of his first wife, the Ross family had demanded this union as a condition to maintain the business partnership that sustained half of the company's business. If Lawrence gave up the marriage, he would lose not only Millionaire contracts, but also legal protection against the lawsuits that his enemies constantly filed against him. Isabella was a beautiful, educated woman from the same social class as him, someone who understood the rules of the game they were forced to play, but she was also cold as marble, calculating like a machine, incapable of awakening in him any feeling beyond a protocol courtesy. The wedding was scheduled for 6 months from now, would be a gigantic event that would definitively seal his position in high New York society. Meanwhile, the investigations that Sarah and Lawrence conducted together revealed increasingly sinister layers of the conspiracy. They discovered that the human trafficking scheme had international ramifications, with roots that passed through the United States, Mexico, Canada, and reached Europe and Asia. The documents showed that young people were kidnapped or bought from desperate families, then transported as specialized employees to countries where they were sold for slave labor or prostitution. It was during one of these investigations that Sarah made a discovery that made her world collapse. Among the names of victims identified in one of the oldest documents, she found the name that had haunted her for 4 years, Michael Johnson, her younger brother. He had disappeared when he was only 16, after accepting a job offer at a farm upstate that turned out to be false. The family had never heard from him again. Now Sarah discovered that Michael hadn't simply disappeared. He had been sold as a human mule to international cartels used to transport drugs and weapons across borders. The documents indicated that he was still alive, but imprisoned somewhere on the border between Mexico and Texas, being used as a slave by traffickers. To save him, Sarah would need to hand over to the authorities the only definitive proof that incriminated Lawrence as negligent in supervising his own company. The document showed that he had signed authorizations for suspicious transfers without properly verifying the recipients. Technically, this would make him an accomplice to the scheme, even if unconsciously. If Sarah handed over this evidence, Lawrence would be arrested, tried, and probably convicted, losing everything he had built. But if she didn't, her brother would die in the hands of traffickers. The dilemma consumed her from within like acid. She loved Lawrence with an intensity that frightened her, but she also loved the brother she had helped raise after their father's death. How to choose between the man who had awakened feelings in her that she didn't know existed, and the brother, who represented the only family she had left. In this whirlwind of guilt, forbidden love, and deadly conspiracies, Sarah and Lawrence began to experience moments of extreme tension that tested all the boundaries they had established between them. The nights of work became emotional minefields, where each look lasted a second longer than it should, where each accidental touch when passing documents to each other sent waves of electricity through their bodies. One of these nights, Lawrence decided to teach English to Sarah, justifying that she would need the language to better understand the international documents they were analyzing. They sat side by side at the conference table, the panoramic office offering a stunning view of New York, illuminated like a constellation of terrestrial stars. Lawrence guided her hand over the laptop keyboard, his long, calloused fingers covering her small, trembling ones, while pronouncing English words with that Italian accent that made her stomach contract with desire. When Sarah made a mistake, Lawrence leaned closer to correct her, and she could feel the heat of his breath on her neck, could perceive the woody scent of expensive perfume mixed with the natural aroma of masculine skin. Her hands seemed to burn where he touched them, and she was sure he could hear the erratic beats of her heart. Lawrence, in turn, fought against the urge to turn her face to his, to touch the rosy lips that seemed made to be kissed, to discover if her skin was as soft as it seemed. The situation became even more complicated when Lawrence was forced to take her to an important corporate dinner where several international investors would be present to discuss new contracts. Sarah would need to be there as his assistant to present the audit data they had prepared together. The problem was that she had never been to a fine restaurant, had never worn elegant clothes, had never learned the social rules that governed that world of crystal and silverware. Lawrence took her shopping for a dress, insisting it was a company expense. In the expensive store on Fifth Avenue, Sarah felt like an imposter among perfect mannequins and saleswomen who looked at her with barely disguised disdain. When she came out of the fitting room wearing a simple but elegant black dress that enhanced her slim waist and made her eyes shine like jewels, Lawrence was speechless. She was beautiful in a natural and honest way that completely contrasted with the artificial beauty of the women in his social circle. At dinner, Sarah humiliated herself in front of everyone by not knowing how to use the multiple utensils, spilling red wine on her new dress, by not understanding the French jokes that the guests made. The looks of superiority and ironic smiles made her want to disappear under the ground. But when one of the investors made a malicious comment about the dubious origin of new employees, Lawrence stood up from his chair with a contained fury that made the entire restaurant fall silent. He extended his hand to Sarah, helped her to stand, and declared to all present that this woman was the only person capable of saving them from bankruptcy, that her intelligence was worth more than all the expensive diplomas at that table combined. The pride she saw in his eyes when he spoke those words was like a healing balm for her wounded self-esteem. But it was after dinner, in the elevator of the hotel where the event had taken place, that the tension between them finally exploded. The elevator stopped between two floors due to a technical problem, and they were stuck there for almost an hour. In the confined space, surrounded by mirrors that infinitely multiplied the image of the two, the proximity became almost unbearable. Sarah was leaning against the mirrored wall, trying to maintain distance, but Lawrence approached slowly, placing a hand on each side of her face, prisoner between his masculine arms and the cold wall. He looked at her as if trying to memorize every detail of her feminine face, as if he knew that this moment could be the last between them. When he inclined his face and his lips touched her neck in a warm and lingering kiss, Sarah almost fainted, from pleasure and fear. It was the first time a man had touched her that way, and the sensations that ran through her body were so intense that she didn't know whether to flee or completely surrender. Lawrence's large hands enveloped her face as if she were made of precious porcelain, his thumbs caressing her cheekbones while his lips left a trail of fire along the side of her neck. Her small body was pressed against his broad chest, and she could feel Lawrence's broken breathing, could sense that he was fighting against himself, against a desire that threatened to consume them both. When the elevator finally started working again, they separated as if they had received an electric shock, but the taste of that kiss, the memory of that touch, remained burning on Sarah's skin for days. In the days following the elevator episode, Sarah and Lawrence tried to maintain a professional distance that became more difficult with each shared hour. The air between them was charged with a dangerous electricity, as if at any moment a spark could ignite everything around them. Lawrence became more serious, more distant, speaking to her only about work, avoiding any physical contact. But Sarah noticed how his eyes followed her when she crossed the office, how he clenched his fists when other men spoke to her. It was during one of these tense mornings that Sarah finally gathered the courage to confront him about the discovery she had made weeks ago. She waited for all employees to leave for lunch, closed the office door and placed the bank transfer document on his desk. Lawrence looked at the paper and immediately understood what she had discovered. His face paled, and for a moment he seemed much younger, almost vulnerable. He told her about that day 4 years ago when he was leaving a meeting at the hospital where his late wife had been treated. He saw Sarah running through the corridors, desperate, screaming for help for a bleeding woman in her arms. Doctors ignored her, said there were no vacancies, that she should look for the public system. Lawrence couldn't explain why he interfered, why he got involved in the situation of two strangers. Perhaps it was the memory of his own pain, the feeling of helplessness in the face of death. He simply couldn't stand still watching that girl lose her mother for lack of money. Sarah cried upon hearing the story, finally understanding that the threads connecting their lives were much older and more complex than she had imagined. But the conversation was interrupted when Richard Monroe, the corrupt CFO, entered the office without knocking. He looked at the two with suspicion, noting the documents spread over the desk, the proximity between them, the tears on Sarah's face. His small, calculating eyes shone with a malice that made Sarah feel a chill down her spine. From that day on, the threats intensified. Sarah began to receive silent phone calls in the middle of the night, found her house ransacked when she returned from work, discovered that someone had followed her mother to the market. The feeling of being constantly watched made her paranoid, making her look over her shoulder at every corner, check the locks on the house multiple times before sleeping. Lawrence noticed the change in Sarah's behavior and pressured her until she told him about the threats. When he learned what was happening, his fury was so intense that she was afraid of him. He immediately hired private security to protect her, but Sarah refused, saying that would draw even more attention to her and put her mother in greater danger. That's when Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She decided to use herself as bait to discover who was behind the threats. Pretending to be too shaken to continue the investigation, she told Lawrence that she needed a few days off to take care of her mother. But in secret, she continued investigating alone, using the accesses she had memorized, working on the files during the early morning when the building was empty. It was during one of these nocturnal incursions that she discovered the file that revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. Richard Monroe wasn't just diverting money from the company, he was using Morgan Holdings as a front for an international human trafficking operation that involved politicians, judges, and businessmen from various countries. The file showed photos, documents, recordings of conversations that incriminated people too powerful to be touched by common justice. But the most shocking thing was discovering that Lawrence had been manipulated for years. His first wife hadn't accidentally fallen from the balcony. She had been murdered because she discovered part of the scheme and threatened to denounce everything. Richard had orchestrated her death to make it look like an accident, and since then blackmailed Lawrence with false evidence that would incriminate him if he tried to investigate his wife's death. The arranged marriage with Isabella was also part of the plan. She wasn't just the daughter of the former father-in-law, she was an active accomplice in the scheme, responsible for laundering money through fake charity foundations. The marriage would definitively seal Richard's control over Lawrence and the company. Sarah printed all the documents, recorded the conversations on flash drives, organized the evidence so that it could be delivered simultaneously to the FBI, the district attorney, and the press. But when she was leaving the building in the early morning, carrying a backpack full of evidence, she was intercepted by two men in the underground parking lot. They didn't say a word, simply grabbed her, placed a hood over her head, and threw her into the trunk of a car. Sarah screamed until she was hoarse, fought until her strength was exhausted, but it did no good. They drove for hours, leaving New York, entering rural roads where her screams wouldn't be heard by anyone. When they finally stopped, Sarah was dragged to an abandoned warehouse that smelled of burnt oil and mold. She recognized Richard Monroe's voice ordering them to tie her to a chair to keep her alive until he decided what to do with her. He knew exactly what she had discovered, which files she had accessed, how much evidence she had copied. He explained, with a cruel smile, that Sarah was just a disposable piece in the game he had been playing for years. Her death would be attributed to a kidnapping gone wrong, just another poor young woman who disappeared in the urban violence of New York. Lawrence would be devastated, would blame himself, and would become even easier to control. The plan was perfect, if not for a detail that Richard hadn't considered. Lawrence knew exactly where Sarah was. Lawrence had installed a location app on Sarah's phone without her knowing, not out of distrust, but out of a desperate need to protect her that he couldn't fully explain himself. When he realized she hadn't arrived home the night before, when he called her mother and discovered that Sarah had lied about taking care of her, an icy terror took hold of his chest. He tracked the phone to an abandoned warehouse in Long Island, in a decaying industrial area where bankrupt companies left behind skeletons of concrete and metal. Lawrence didn't call the police. He didn't trust anyone in the WAM system he knew was infiltrated by corruption. Instead, he gathered 3 men of his absolute trust, ex-military who worked in his personal security, and set off for the rescue. When they arrived at the warehouse, Lawrence felt a primitive fury taking control of every cell in his body. Through a broken window, he could see Sarah tied to a chair in the center of the empty space, her face swollen from beatings, her lips cracked, but her eyes still shining with a flame of resistance that made his heart contract with pride and despair. Richard Monroe was there, along with 4 armed henchmen, explaining to Sarah how her death would be staged, how Lawrence would be psychologically destroyed by her loss. He didn't know that every word was being recorded by the equipment Lawrence carried, that every confession would be used to bring him down definitively. The rescue operation was quick and brutal. Lawrence's men were trained professionals, while Richard's henchmen were just common criminals. In less than 5 minutes, the kidnappers were on the ground, some dead, others wounded and immobilized. Richard tried to use Sarah as a human shield, pressing a gun against her head, but Lawrence approached slowly, hands raised, speaking in a low and controlled voice. When Richard lowered his guard for a second, distracted by a noise, Lawrence moved with feline speed, disarming him and knocking him to the ground with a violence that surprised even his own men. He had to be restrained from killing Richard with his bare hands. The anger he felt was so intense, it seemed capable of igniting the air around him. When he finally managed to free Sarah from the ropes that bound her, she collapsed in his arms, trembling from shock and relief. Lawrence held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe, whispering promises in Italian, swearing that he would never again allow anyone to hurt her. He carried her out of the warehouse, placed her in the back seat of the car, and ordered his men to deliver Richard and the survivors to the FBI, along with all the recordings of the rescue. On the way to the hospital, Sarah told him everything she had discovered about the conspiracy, about the murder of his first wife, about the arranged marriage, about the human trafficking scheme. Lawrence listened in silence, his jaw clenched, processing the magnitude of the betrayal he had suffered for years. When she mentioned the file that proved her brother Michael's location, he stopped the car on the highway shoulder. Looking into her eyes with an intensity that made Sarah forget to breathe, Lawrence said he would do anything to bring Michael back, that he would move heaven and earth to reunite her family. He had lost his first wife and child for not noticing the danger signs around them. He would not lose Sarah nor allow her to lose her brother because of his negligence. In the following weeks, Lawrence set in motion an international operation that involved FBI agents, contacts in the American government, and even human rights organizations. Using the information Sarah had discovered, they located the trafficking network that kept Michael and dozens of other young Americans in captivity. The rescue operation was successful, and Michael was freed after 4 years of nightmare. When Sarah reunited with her brother at JFK Airport, too thin, with scars that told stories he still couldn't verbalize, but alive, she cried so much that Lawrence was afraid she would become dehydrated. Michael, now 20 years old, looked at the elegant man who had made the rescue possible and immediately understood why his sister looked at him with that mixture of love and veneration. But Michael's liberation was just the beginning of the changes that followed. The FBI investigation, based on the evidence Sarah had collected, brought down a corruption network that extended to the highest levels of government. Richard Monroe was arrested and convicted, as were Isabella and dozens of other accomplices. Morgan Holdings underwent a complete audit that revealed the extent of the damage caused by corruption. Lawrence lost Millionaire contracts, saw the company's market value plummet, faced lawsuits that kept him busy for months. Several investors withdrew their support, and the press crucified him as negligent, even knowing he had been the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. His late wife's family, discovering they had been deceived about the circumstances of her death, definitively expelled him from the social circle he had frequented for years. But while his professional world collapsed, Lawrence discovered something he didn't expect. He didn't care. For the first time since his first wife's death, he slept in peace, knowing his hands were clean, that his company operated within the law, that there were no more dark secrets haunting his conscience. He had lost money, prestige, and social position, but he had recovered something much more valuable: his soul. With the company in reconstruction and his reputation still recovering from the scandals, Lawrence dedicated himself to transforming Morgan Holdings into something completely different from what it had been before. He fired all employees who were involved, even indirectly, in the corruption schemes, and hired a new, young, and idealistic team led by Sarah, who now occupied the position of Director of Compliance and Transparency. Sarah had changed dramatically since the days she cleaned floors wearing a light blue uniform. Now she wore tailored women's suits, mastered 3 languages, and commanded a team of auditors with a natural authority that impressed even the most experienced executives. But what impressed Lawrence most was that, despite all the external transformation, she remained the same pure-hearted woman who had risked her life to save people she didn't even know. Michael, meanwhile, was undergoing intensive therapy to overcome the trauma of 4 years in captivity, but showed impressive resilience. He had decided to study law, specialize in human rights, to help other trafficking victims like he had been. Lawrence funded all the young man's studies, not as charity, but as an investment in someone he considered family. Sarah's mother, Mrs. Johnson, had also benefited from the new situation. With access to quality psychiatric treatment and appropriate medication, she was living the best period of her adult life. She had returned to cooking, smiling, making plans for the future. She adored Lawrence, treated him like the son she never had, and constantly asked Sarah when they were going to get married. But that was exactly the question that had been tormenting Lawrence for months. He and Sarah worked together daily, shared important decisions, trusted each other completely, but had never spoken openly about the feelings that grew between them like plants that need sunlight to flourish. The difference in age, social class, life experience still weighed on him like a constant shadow. Lawrence knew he was in love with Sarah in a way he had never experienced even in his first marriage. It wasn't just physical passion, although the attraction between them was intense enough to charge the air whenever they were alone in the same room. It was something deeper, more complete, as if she were the part of his soul that he didn't know was lost. But he also knew that Sarah deserved someone who could offer her a new life, free from the ghosts of the past that haunted him. She deserved a man who didn't carry the weight of having lost a wife and a child, who didn't have powerful enemies, who didn't constantly need to look over his shoulder to check if they were safe. Sarah, in turn, was going through an equally intense internal conflict. She loved Lawrence with every fiber of her being, but also feared that he saw her only as a charity project, as the poor girl he had saved and transformed. Sometimes, when he looked at her with that protective expression, she wondered if what he felt for her was true love or just a mixture of guilt and responsibility. The situation became even more complicated when Sarah was accepted into a master's program in international business at Columbia University with a full scholarship and the possibility of an exchange in Europe. It was a unique opportunity that would open doors to an international career that would make her truly financially independent. Lawrence encouraged her to accept, even knowing that this would mean spending 2 years away from him, even knowing that she could meet other men, build a life where he would have no place. He wanted her to be free to choose her own destiny, without feeling obliged to stay with him out of gratitude or economic dependence. But Sarah interpreted Lawrence's encouragement in a completely different way. For her, the fact that he was so willing to let her go was proof that his feelings weren't as deep as she had imagined. If he truly loved her, he wouldn't be able to live without her, just as she couldn't imagine a life without him. The tension between them became almost unbearable during the weeks leading up to the decision about the master's program. They avoided being alone, communicated only through professional emails, maintained a physical distance that seemed like an emotional abyss. The company employees noticed that something was wrong between the two, but no one dared to comment. It was Michael who finally decided to intervene. He invited Lawrence to dinner at the family's house, in the new house they had bought in a middle-class neighborhood, with the money Lawrence had insisted on giving as compensation for the suffering Sarah had gone through because of the company. During dinner, prepared with all the care by Mrs. Johnson, Michael looked directly at Lawrence and said it was time for him to stop being a coward. That anyone with eyes in their head could see that he and Sarah loved each other, that they were miserable when they weren't together, that they were wasting a love that most people would spend their entire lives looking for. Lawrence tried to explain about the differences between them, about the past that haunted him, about the uncertain future he had no right to offer Sarah. But Michael, with the premature wisdom of someone who had faced hell and survived, said that the only thing that mattered was that they loved each other. Everything else was just obstacles that could be overcome if they faced them together. Michael's words echoed in Lawrence's mind for days, like a mantra that refused to be silenced. He spent nights without sleeping, walking through the penthouse, apartment that now seemed empty and meaningless to him, looking at New York City, stretching at his feet like a sea of lonely lights. Each light represented a life, a story, and he wondered how many of these people had found true love and wasted it out of fear, pride, social conventions that meant absolutely nothing in the end. Sarah, in turn, had decided to accept the master's program, but couldn't sign the final papers. Every time she picked up the pen, her hands trembled, and she found herself thinking of Lawrence, imagining what it would be like to live 2 years without seeing him every day, without hearing his voice, without feeling that electricity in the air whenever he was nearby. She put the documents in the drawer and postponed the decision until the next day, then until the next week, knowing she was being a coward, but unable to do differently. The situation reached its limit on a rainy Friday in October when a violent storm hit New York and forced Sarah to work late because the company's systems had been overloaded with a complex international audit. She was alone in the office. All the other employees had gone home when Lawrence arrived soaking wet from the rain, his dark hair stuck to his forehead, his soaked suit clinging to his body in a way that made her heart dangerously accelerate. He had returned to retrieve some documents, but when he saw Sarah there concentrating on the computer screen, illuminated only by the bluish light of the monitor and the lightning that cut through the dark sky, he felt he could no longer postpone that conversation. They needed to talk about the elephant in the room, about the feelings that grew between them like a storm that refused to be ignored. Lawrence approached slowly, pulled up a chair, and sat beside her. When Sarah raised her eyes from the screen, he saw in them a vulnerability that made his chest contract with tenderness and despair. Without saying a word, he extended his hand and touched her face, his fingers caressing her smooth skin as if she were made of precious silk. The conversation that followed was the most important in both of their lives. Lawrence spoke about his fears, about the feeling that he didn't deserve her love, about the terror that she would leave him when she discovered all his flaws, all the scars he carried in his soul. Sarah cried when he confessed that he loved her more than he had loved anyone in his life, but that he wanted her to be free to choose her own destiny, even if that meant losing her forever. Sarah, in turn, said she felt like an imposter in his world, that she was afraid that one day he would wake up and realize he had fallen in love with an illusion, with the improved version of herself that he had helped create. She confessed that she had refused 3 invitations to go out with men her age because she couldn't stop thinking about him, that she dreamed of him every night, that she woke up every day hoping to see him. That's when Lawrence stood up, pulled, Sarah from her chair and kissed her with a desperate passion that he had been repressing for months. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, desire, unconditional love, promises that words couldn't express. Sarah melted in his arms, feeling that she was finally home, in the place where she should always have been. When they separated, breathless, Lawrence held her face between his hands and said he didn't want to waste another single day without her. That he didn't care what people would think, about the differences between them, about the past that had marked them. He wanted to build a future by her side, wanted to wake up every day knowing she was there, wanted to grow old watching her, become the amazing woman she was already becoming. Sarah laughed and cried at the same time, saying she had spent months waiting for him to say exactly those words, that the master's program could wait, that she had discovered that the most important knowledge she could acquire was how to love and be loved by him, that all the diplomas in the world weren't worth a single day beside the man who had transformed her life into something magical. They made love for the first time right there, in the office where everything had begun, with the rain beating on the windows and lightning, illuminating their intertwined bodies. It was Sarah's first time, and Lawrence was infinitely gentle, patient, transforming what could have been just sex into a spiritual experience that forever sealed the union between their souls. When dawn broke, they were lying on the leather sofa in the office, covered by Lawrence's jacket, watching the sun rise over New York through the panoramic windows. Sarah was nestled against his chest, listening to the beats of the heart that now completely belonged to her, while Lawrence caressed her hair and planned aloud the future they would build together. He said he wanted to marry her, but not a pompous ceremony that would serve only to impress others. He wanted something simple, intimate, just with the people they really loved. He wanted Michael to be his best man, Mrs. Johnson to bless them, for them to start their own family when she felt ready. Sarah smiled, kissed Lawrence's bare chest, where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady, and said yes to everything. Yes to the marriage, yes to the family, yes to a lifetime beside the man who had taught her heart to fly. 2 years later, Sarah Johnson Morgan stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom she shared with Lawrence, adjusting the simple white dress she had chosen for the vow renewal ceremony. They had already married in civil court 6 months after that transformative night in the office, in an intimate ceremony at City Hall, with only Michael, Mrs. Johnson, and some close friends as witnesses. But today, on their second wedding anniversary, they would renew their vows in a religious ceremony in the small church in the neighborhood where Sarah had grown up. Their life had changed in ways that neither could have predicted. Morgan Holdings, now reformulated as a corporate transparency consulting firm, was smaller than before, but also more respected and profitable. Sarah had completed her master's degree studying part-time, specializing in combating international corruption, and was now recognized as one of the country's leading experts in the field. She frequently traveled to give lectures at universities and international conferences, always with Lawrence by her side, proud to introduce her as his wife and business partner. Michael had graduated in law with honors and had just been accepted into a doctoral program in human rights at Harvard University. He had become a respected activist lawyer, representing victims of human trafficking and working with international organizations to combat this crime. The traumatic experience he had lived through had transformed into his greatest strength, allowing him to help other people who went through the same suffering. Mrs. Johnson was unrecognizable, radiant with happiness and health. She had returned to work, now as a coordinator of a community center that Sarah and Lawrence had founded in the Brighton Beach neighborhood. The center offered professional courses, psychological support, and legal assistance for families in vulnerable situations. It was the pride of Mrs. Johnson's life, who said she had finally found her purpose in the world. As Sarah got ready for the ceremony, her hands unconsciously paused over her still discreetly rounded belly. She was 3 months pregnant, a wonderful surprise she had discovered the week before. She hadn't told Lawrence yet, planning to give him the news as a wedding anniversary gift after the ceremony. Lawrence entered the room at that moment, elegant, in a navy blue suit that highlighted his eyes, now more serene and happy than Sarah had ever seen them. At 39, he looked younger than when they met, as if love had erased years of suffering from his face. When he saw Sarah in the white dress, his eyes filled with tears of gratitude. They had overcome so many obstacles together. The criticism from New York society that had never fully accepted the union between the Italian businessman and the former cleaner. The challenges of building an ethical company in a still corrupt market. The nights when Sarah woke up with nightmares about the kidnapping, and Lawrence cradled her in his arms until she fell back asleep. His moments of insecurity, when he still doubted if he deserved such happiness after all he had lost, but each obstacle overcome had strengthened the love between them, like iron that becomes more resistant in fire. They had learned that true love wasn't just about passion and romance, but about choosing to be by the other person's side every day, especially on the difficult days. It was about growing together, mutually transforming into better versions of themselves, building something greater than the sum of their individual parts. The ceremony at the church was exactly as Sarah had dreamed as a child when she still believed in fairy tales. The small church was decorated with simple but fragrant flowers, and each bench was occupied by people who truly loved them. Company employees, neighborhood neighbors, university colleagues, friends they had made over the years. There was no ostentation or unnecessary luxury, just genuine love filling every inch of the sacred space. When Sarah walked down the aisle of the church, led by Michael, who had assumed the role of the father she never had, Lawrence had to lean on the altar. To avoid fainting from emotion, she was radiant, luminous, with a happiness that seemed to come from within, and he couldn't believe that this amazing woman had chosen to share her life with him. The vows they exchanged were written by themselves, words that came directly from the heart. Lawrence promised that he would always protect Sarah, but also that he would let her fly when she needed to explore the world. He promised that he would love her not only when she was strong and brave, but especially when she felt fragile and vulnerable. He promised that together they would build a legacy of honesty and compassion that would honor the love they felt. Sarah promised that she would always believe in Lawrence, even when he doubted himself. She promised that she would be his partner in all aspects of life, in business and in intimacy, in joys and in sorrows. She promised that she would love him not only for the man he was, but for the man he inspired her to be. When the priest declared them husband and wife again, and Lawrence kissed Sarah under the emotional applause of the guests, she whispered in his ear the news of the pregnancy. Lawrence's reaction was so intense that he lifted her off the ground and spun her in his arms, laughing and crying at the same time, while the entire church erupted in tears of joy. Months later, as they were decorating the baby's room in the new house they had bought in a quiet New York neighborhood, Sarah found Lawrence sitting on the floor, assembling a light wooden crib. She approached, ran her hands through his hair that now had some gray strands, and said she had never imagined that happiness could be something so simple and yet so profound. Lawrence raised his eyes to her, placed his hands on the belly that now clearly showed the presence of the child they were expecting, and said that she had taught his heart to believe in miracles again, that his life before her had been just a preparation for this moment, for this family, for this love that seemed to grow with each passing day. Sarah smiled, knelt beside him on the floor, where years ago she had cleaned as an invisible employee, and said that he was clean enough to live by her side forever. They laughed at the reference to the past, but also understood the profound symbolism of those words. They had purified each other, washed away all the pains and fears of the past, and now they were ready